Damian Caruso hadn't lost control in years. Not since the night his brother's blood soaked the marble floors of his penthouse, and he swore that emotion would never rule him again. But when Nora Blake burst from his private lounge, blouse torn, voice shaking, mascara carving rivers down her cheeks, something ancient and dangerous clawed its way up from the quiet inside him. For a second, he didn't move. He simply looked at her, the trembling hands, the broken sob that caught in her throat, the way the entire club seemed to tilt toward her pain. Then, in a voice that sounded almost gentle, he asked, "Who harassed you?" Every sound died. Conversations strangled mid-word. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the jazz bleeding from the corner speakers seemed to stutter. The men who worked for him had heard that tone once before, right before an enemy family disappeared from the East River docks. Some men learned about consequences through apologies. Others learned through the cold silence that comes right before a city starts to freeze. The story doesn't end here. Subscribe to Mafia Soul now to see what happened next. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. This one started in New York, the night the devil finally remembered he had a heart. 6 months earlier, Nora Blake thought Damian Caruso was just another impossible boss with too much money and not enough patience. She'd been his executive assistant for exactly 3 weeks before realizing that Caruso Holdings wasn't the kind of company you found on LinkedIn. The signs were there, the sleek office with bulletproof glass, the way armed men called him signore instead of sir, the phone calls in Italian that made her straighten in her chair without knowing why. But she needed the job. 25, drowning in student loans and Manhattan rent that devoured half her paycheck. Nora couldn't afford curiosity. And Damian Caruso, for all his reputation, paid better than anyone else in the city. He treated her with the kind of cool professionalism that was almost old-fashioned, never inappropriate, never unkind, just exacting. Ruthlessly exacting. Still, there were moments, tiny, electric moments, when she caught something human behind the marble facade. Like the time she brought him coffee and he'd said, "Thank you, Miss Blake," without looking up, yet his voice softened in a way that made her forget her own name. Or the time a client raised his voice at her during a meeting and Damian's amber-gray eyes had lifted, cold as the ocean, until the man apologized and left stammering. Everyone in that office feared him. Nora respected him. Maybe that was the problem. Damian Caruso was 38 years old and looked like sin polished in a charm. 6'2", shoulders filling the custom Italian suits that moved like second skin, hair dark and always immaculately styled. But it was his hands that betrayed him. Faint scars across the knuckles, the kind that didn't come from boardrooms. Fighter's hands. His voice carried low and calm, the way a blade hums before it cuts. Most days, Nora managed to keep her head down and her pulse steady. She was proud of that. Until one Thursday evening in late October, the night the sky cracked open with thunder and truth. She had stayed late, finishing quarterly reports, when voices drifted through the glass wall of Damian's office. "The Vespri family is testing our shipment routes again," a man said. Carlo, his security chief, maybe. Damian's reply was a slow drawl, too smooth to be safe. "Let them test. When they touch my docks, they touch my patients, and I don't have much left." Then silence, the kind that carries violence beneath it. Nora froze, hands hovering above the keyboard. Vespri. She'd heard that name on the news. Organized crime investigations, missing shipments, unexplained fires. Her pulse hammered. She should quit, pack up and vanish before his world noticed she existed. But when Damian stepped out minutes later, jacket slung over his shoulder, and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, just a man thanking an employee for working late, something in her decided to stay. Maybe it was fear, maybe fascination, or maybe it was the way his eyes lingered a second too long, as if memorizing her before walking into whatever darkness waited outside. That was the beginning, before the blood, before the night the city went cold. The week after that late-night revelation, Nora Blake typed her resignation letter 3 separate times and deleted it every single time. Logic told her to run. Everything about Damian Caruso screamed danger. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room, how men twice his size waited for him to speak like soldiers before a general, how one quiet glance from him could change the air itself. But beneath the fear, another feeling lingered, curiosity. The kind that felt like standing too close to the edge of a tall building and wondering what the fall would feel like. Every morning, she told herself she'd quit. Every evening, she stayed. That Tuesday, Damian's calendar filled with red alerts, back-to-back meetings with suppliers, accountants, and one particular name highlighted in black, Victor Dane. She hadn't heard of him before, but the way Carlo, Damian's head of security, tensed when he saw the name made her stomach tighten. By 6 p.m., the office had emptied except for the core team. Damian moved through the space like a storm contained inside a tailored suit, his voice low as he issued orders. "Keep this meeting clean," he said to Carlo, his tone precise. "Dane's money's useful, but I don't trust men who smile too much." Then his gaze shifted, landing on her. It wasn't a glance. It was an evaluation. A pause. "Miss Blake," he said, "stay for notes. No interruptions." Her throat went dry. Of course. When the elevator opened 20 minutes later, Victor Dane stepped out as if he owned the building. Tall, charming, maybe 45. His confidence wasn't earned. It was worn like cologne, heavy and obvious. A tailored navy suit, hair slicked back, grin polished for boardrooms and lies. "Damian Caruso," he drawled, offering a handshake too familiar. "Always a pleasure to meet the legend in person." "Victor," Damian replied, voice like ice melting slowly. "Let's get this over with." The meeting began civil enough. Numbers, partnerships, trade routes. Nora sat quietly beside Damian, recording details, her posture perfect even as the back of her neck prickled. Dane's gaze found her often, lingering a little too long each time he spoke. She tried to focus on the figures in her notepad, but her instinct screamed something else entirely. Predator. At one point, Victor leaned back in his chair, eyes sliding toward her. "You run a tight ship, Caruso, but I must say, your staff is exceptional." His smile sharpened. "You don't see that kind of loyalty often." Nora pretended not to hear the undertone. Damian didn't pretend at all. "She's efficient," Damian said, each word measured, "and not part of this conversation." Victor's laugh was too loud, too smooth. Didn't mean any disrespect. Beautiful and efficient. It's a dangerous combination. The tension fractured the air like a hairline crack in glass. Damian didn't blink. He simply looked at Victor, long enough for the grin to falter. Then he returned to his paperwork, calm as a blade sliding back into its sheath. The rest of the meeting dragged on in silence, thick enough to taste. When it finally ended, Damian stood first. "Carlo, walk Mr. Dane out." Victor waved it off with false warmth. "No need. I'll find my own way." Damian's phone buzzed just then. He checked the screen. His expression shifted, unreadable. "Miss Blake," he said, eyes flicking to her. "Finish the minutes and send them to my private line. I need to take this call." He stepped into the hallway, voice dropping as the glass door closed behind him. Nora gathered the papers, relieved to finally breathe again. But before she could rise from her chair, Victor's reflection appeared in the polished glass across from her. "You know," he said softly, coming closer, "for someone who works for a man like Caruso, you've got a terrible poker face." Nora straightened. "The meeting's over, Mr. Dane." He smiled, leaning a little too close. "Relax. I was just thinking, you've been cooped up in this office all evening. How about I show you the private lounge downstairs? Finest collection of scotch in the city." Her pulse stumbled. The invitation wasn't really a question. "No, thank you," she said evenly, clutching the folder against her chest like a shield. Victor's grin widened, predatory and pleased. "Come now, Miss Blake. One drink won't hurt." And from the hallway, Damian's low voice still murmured into his phone. Too far to hear, too far to stop what was about to unfold. The hallway outside the office was quiet, too quiet. The low hum of city lights through the tinted windows was the only thing that moved. Nora could still hear Damian's voice somewhere beyond the frosted glass, steady and calm as ever, while Victor Dane lingered by the doorway with that smirk that made her skin crawl. She told herself to keep working. Just finish the notes, send the file, leave. But when she looked up, Victor was still there, hands in his pockets, watching her like a cat with a trapped bird. "Why so serious?" he asked, his tone too smooth, too lazy. "You act like I'm going to bite." "Mr. Dane," she said, standing, her voice steady only because she forced it to be, "Mr. Caruso will be back in a moment. You can wait outside." Victor chuckled. "You really think he's coming back for you?" The words hung there, heavy and poisonous. She grabbed her tablet, meaning to go, but his hand shot out, catching her wrist, tight, possessive, reeking of whiskey. "I said let go," she hissed, jerking her arm, but his fingers only dug deeper. "Relax," he murmured, leaning in close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You think you're special, don't you? Working for a man like Caruso, getting all that attention. Bet you like it when he looks at you." Nora's stomach turned. "You're drunk." "Drunk." He laughed. "Maybe, but I'm not wrong." She yanked again, but he was faster, stronger. The next thing she knew, he'd backed her toward the corridor, guiding her down the hall toward the elevator. "Let go of me," she said, her voice rising, echoing against the marble. He pressed the elevator button with one hand, still holding her with the other. "Just 5 minutes," he said, like it was a promise instead of threat. "You'll thank me after one drink." The doors slid open, and before she could think, he shoved her inside. The elevator descended fast, the metallic hum filling the silence between them. Nora's pulse was a drumbeat in her ears. When the doors opened again, they were on the lower level, the executive lounge. It was dimly lit, empty except for soft music and a glow of amber bottles lining the bar. "See," Victor said, stepping out first, sweeping his arm like a host welcoming a guest. "Private, comfortable, no witnesses." Nora didn't move. "I'm going back upstairs." "Come on," he said, circling behind her, his voice dropping. "Don't play shy now. I saw the way you look at him. You think he cares? You're just another pretty piece in his collection." She turned, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear her own voice. "You don't know anything about him. Or me." He laughed again, stepping closer, cornering her against the shelves. "I know enough. Caruso doesn't share. So let's see what he sees in you." He reached for her. She shoved his hand away hard. His smile cracked. "Don't," she started, but he was already on her, his hand snatching her arm, the other gripping her blouse. The sound of tearing fabric filled the air. She gasped, clawed at his wrist, bit down on his palm. He cursed, jerking back, and in that split second of freedom, she ran. The corridor blurred. Her heels slipped against the polished floor as she sprinted toward the elevator. She hit the button again and again, whispering, "Please, please, please." The doors slid open. She dove inside, heart slamming against her ribs, blood roaring in her ears. As the elevator climbed, she pressed the torn fabric of her blouse, closed with shaking hands, the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. Every second felt like a lifetime. She wanted to scream, to cry, but the air in her lungs had frozen. When the doors finally opened, she ran. Past the guards, past the conference room, straight to the only place that felt safe. Damian's office door burst open with a crash that silenced the world. He looked up from behind his desk, phone still in hand, mid-sentence, then stopped. His gaze locked on her, the tear in her blouse, the red mark on her wrist, the terror in her eyes. The phone slipped from his hand. "Who?" His voice dropped to something low and lethal. "Harassed you?" And for the first time since she started working for him, Nora didn't see the man everyone feared. She saw the storm he'd spent years trying to contain break wide open. For a heartbeat, no one in the club breathed. The world shrank to the sound of Nora's ragged sobs and the soft, deliberate inhale of the man standing across the room. Damian Caruso didn't move right away. He simply looked at her, really looked. The tear in her blouse, the blood rising beneath the skin of her wrist, the silent plea in her eyes. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough to make the air itself shiver. "Oh," he asked, "harassed you?" Every man in the room went still. Even the music from the jazz trio faltered mid-note. The city outside could have been burning, and still the club would have stayed silent. Nora couldn't speak. Her throat closed around the words, choking on shame and panic. Her hands trembled at her sides, clutching torn fabric. Damian took one step closer, slow, controlled, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those gray, glacial eyes, were burning. "Tell me his name," he said. Her lips parted. A whisper escaped. "Victor Dane." It was barely a sound, but it might as well have been thunder. From the corner table, Victor froze. The laughter that had been spilling from his mouth seconds earlier died in his throat. His drink hung midair, half raised, before his hand slowly lowered it back to the table. "Damian," he started, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Listen." The glass shattered before he could finish. No one saw Damian move. One moment, he was standing 10 feet away. The next, he was in front of Victor, shards glittering across the table like frozen stars. The next sound was the dull, wet crack of bone against flesh. Victor stumbled back, blood spilling from his mouth, shock replacing arrogance. "What the hell?" Damian hit him again. Once. Twice. Precise. Controlled. Surgical. Each blow delivered with the same terrifying calm he used in meetings, as if he were correcting a mistake rather than dismantling a man. "You touched what's mine," he said softly, voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "And for that, you die." Victor fell to his knees, choking, eyes wide in disbelief. He looked for mercy and found none. Damian's hand closed around his jaw, forcing him to look up. "You thought this city feared money," Damian murmured. "It fears me." Then came the final strike, swift, brutal, and absolute. Victor crumpled, motionless. No one screamed. No one ran. The witnesses, all men who owed their lives to Caruso, stood in reverent silence as Carlos stepped forward, wordless, to drag Victor's broken body out the back door. The metallic scent of blood mixed with whiskey and cigar smoke. Damian straightened slowly, shoulders rising and falling once. He looked down at his hands, blood-smeared, trembling faintly, as though surprised they still belonged to him. When he finally turned toward Nora, the fury in his eyes had melted into something else, something quieter, more dangerous. She hadn't moved since she'd said the name. Her breath came in shallow bursts. When he approached, she flinched just slightly, and that small movement cracked something deep inside him. He stopped a few feet away, voice soft again. "You're safe now." She shook her head, tears cutting clean lines through her makeup. "You killed him." Damian's jaw flexed. "No," he said evenly. "I ended him." Silence hung between them like smoke. Behind them, Carlo's men finished their grim work, dragging Victor's body out into the night. Damian exhaled slowly, his hand hovering halfway to her face before he stopped himself, afraid to touch her with the same hands that had just delivered death. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said, voice breaking through the steel. "But I meant every word." He took a step back, chest rising and falling, his control barely reassembled. Outside, the city lights flickered in the rain. Inside, the boss of the East Side, the man whose name froze entire boroughs, stood trembling before a woman who'd never once raised her voice at him. That night, the whispers began. Victor Dane had vanished. The Caruso name, already feared, became legend. And in the eye of that quiet, brutal storm, Damian Caruso looked at Nora Blake. blood on his cuffs, guilt in his eyes, and understood that everything he'd built was now hers to destroy. The city outside Damian's penthouse was silent, eerily so. Even Manhattan's chaos seemed to pause beneath the low hum of rain against the windows. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and faint perfume, a fragile calm layered over the violence that had come before. Nora sat on the edge of the leather sofa, still in the torn blouse, eyes red and unfocused. A silk throw hung loosely around her shoulders, too light to stop her shivering. Every sound, the ticking clock, the distant thunder, felt too loud, too sharp. Damian knelt in front of her, sleeves rolled up, a small first aid kit open beside him. The sight of a Mafia boss tending wounds with trembling hands should have been absurd. It wasn't. It was almost unbearable. "Give me your hand," he said quietly. His voice had none of the cold command it usually carried. It was careful, deliberate, as though he was afraid she might break if he spoke too loud. She hesitated, then extended her arm. His fingers brushed the bruised skin on her wrist, and she flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of his gentleness. He froze instantly, eyes flicking up to hers. "I won't hurt you," he said. The words came out rough, like a promise he didn't quite know how to make. "I know," she whispered. He dabbed antiseptic on the mark Victor had left, his jaw tightening with each small motion. When she winced, he stopped, exhaled slowly, and said, "You should have never been there." "I should have." "Stopped him," she interrupted softly. "You did." He shook his head, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Not soon enough." Silence. The kind that sits heavy between two people who've seen too much. Nora studied him, really seeing him for the first time. Not the immaculate suit, not the power, not the myth. The man. His knuckles still bore faint traces of blood he hadn't washed off completely. His eyes looked tired, like he'd been fighting a war no one else could see. "Damian," she said quietly, "I knew." He stilled. "Knew what?" "Who you are. What you are." His hand dropped from her wrist. For a moment, he didn't look at her. Then his voice came, lower, edged with disbelief. "You knew and you stayed?" She nodded, fingers gripping the throw tighter. "Everyone talks. The calls in Italian, the men with guns, the meetings that start after midnight. I'm not stupid." He looked up sharply. "Then why didn't you run?" Her eyes met his, clear, unwavering. "Because you've never made me feel small." That silenced him. Of all the answers he'd prepared himself to hear, fear, curiosity, greed, that one caught him off guard. She went on, her voice shaking but steady. "Every man I've worked for made me feel replaceable. Invisible. You see everything, even when you pretend not to. You make people stand straighter, talk cleaner. You make me believe I'm capable of more than I thought." His throat worked, but no words came. He looked away, staring at the rain, tracing lines down the glass wall behind her. "You should have run when you found out who I am," he said finally, voice raw. "Maybe I didn't want to," she replied. The honesty in her tone cut through him sharper than any blade. He leaned back on his heels, staring at her, as if she were something he didn't deserve to touch but couldn't stop needing. The storm outside rolled closer, lightning flashing across the skyline. For the first time in years, Damian Caruso felt unarmored. His power, his empire, all of it meant nothing compared to the woman sitting before him, bruised, trembling, but unbroken. He reached up slowly, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "You're shaking," he murmured. "So are you," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. In the reflection of the glass, he saw them. Two broken shapes stitched together by a moment that shouldn't have existed. And yet, somehow, it felt inevitable. The city outside was still cold, still afraid. But in that quiet penthouse, for the first time, Damian wasn't. The rain hadn't stopped. It drummed softly against the windows of Damian Caruso's penthouse, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between them. The city stretched below, lights flickering like dying stars, but neither of them looked at it. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that lingered between them. Nora sat curled on the couch, Damian across from her, both wrapped in a silence that was too heavy to be comfortable and too intimate to be ignored. His shirt sleeves were still rolled up, the faint trace of dried blood along one cuff. Yet the way he sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes down, made him look less like a king and more like a man quietly begging forgiveness. Finally, he spoke. "I've spent my whole life learning how to control myself," he said, voice low, "to bury things before they turn into mistakes. That's what power demands." Nora watched him, her breath barely audible. He continued, each word sounding like it had been dragged out from somewhere deep and unwilling. "But ever since you walked into my office, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. The way you talk, the way you move, the way you look at me like you see the man I used to be instead of what I've become." Her pulse kicked up, a trembling heartbeat in her throat. "Damian." He looked up then, meeting her eyes. Whatever restraint he'd been clinging to cracked. "You make me lose focus, Nora. You make me want to be better. And I hate it because I don't know how to want something without destroying it." The honesty in his tone was raw, unguarded. Nora's chest tightened. She'd seen him command rooms, silence men with a look, bring entire districts to heel with a whisper. But this version, the man who could barely hold her gaze, felt infinitely more dangerous. Without realizing it, she moved closer. Her hand lifted, almost on its own, until her fingers brushed the collar of his shirt. Beneath it, against his skin, was the faint outline of an anchor tattoo, ink dark and deliberate. Her fingertips traced the design. "What does it mean?" she asked softly. His breath hitched. "Loyalty," he murmured. "It's what I built my life on. Every man who's ever worn that mark swore his soul to something bigger than himself. For me, it became a chain." Her hand lingered there, over that mark. "Maybe it doesn't have to be." He turned his head slightly, just enough that her fingertips grazed the edge of his jaw. His pulse jumped beneath her touch. "You don't know what you're saying?" he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "I do." Something inside him broke then, not with violence, but with surrender. He reached up, catching her hand in his, pressing it flat against his heart. "I shouldn't," he said, breath uneven. "Not after tonight. Not like this." "Then don't think," she said. That was all it took. He leaned forward, and the space between them disappeared. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce, aching with everything they'd both try to bury. His hand slid to the back of her neck, holding her like she might vanish if he let go. Her fingers tangled in his hair, and for the first time since the world had gone dark, she felt something like safety. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts colliding in the quiet. Damian's eyes closed. "You don't know what it means to be mine," he said softly. She smiled faintly, voice trembling but sure. "Then show me." He exhaled, the sound half a groan, half a prayer. His thumb brushed along her jaw, tracing the curve of her lips. "You're mine now, Nora," he whispered, voice roughened with both promise and warning. "No one touches you again." She didn't flinch this time. She just looked at him, the man who ruled a city and feared a single woman, and nodded. Outside, thunder rolled low over the skyline, but inside the penthouse, everything had gone still. By morning, the city knew. It wasn't on the news, not yet. Those who controlled the papers knew better than to print Caruso's name, but the whispers spread like smoke through every corner of Manhattan's underworld. Victor Dane had vanished after a meeting with Damian Caruso, and everyone knew what that meant. The docks went silent. The gambling dens paused their operations. Even the rival families, the Vescari, the Mancinelli, the Delos, tightened their security. It wasn't the murder that frightened them. It was the message. Damian Caruso had broken his decade of restraint. Nora learned this not from Damian, but from the way people looked at her. The men in tailored suits, who once ignored her now, went quiet when she entered a room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes flicked from her to Damian and back again, like they were watching a fuse burn towards something inevitable. By the end of the week, she couldn't walk through the Caruso Holdings lobby without feeling the weight of a dozen unseen gazes. Her phone buzzed with calls from unknown numbers, silent calls that ended the moment she said hello. Once, someone slipped a note under her desk blotter. "You don't belong in his world." She tore it up before Damian could see. But he saw anyway. He always did. That night, he came to her office after everyone had gone home. The city skyline glowed behind him, making him look more myth than man. "You've been distracted," he said quietly. "I'm fine," she lied. His eyes narrowed. "You're a terrible liar, Nora." She sighed, setting her pen down. "They're whispering. Your people. The others. They think I caused this." "You didn't," he said. "But I was the reason, Victor." "You were the victim," he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. Then, softer, "and anyone who says otherwise won't have a tongue left to say it again." Her throat went dry. There was no threat in his voice, only certainty, the kind that made her both uneasy and impossibly safe. He hesitated, then stepped closer. "You can't stay here anymore." "What?" "My enemies don't draw lines, Nora. If they can't reach me, they'll reach for you." "I'm not afraid," she said, though her voice betrayed her. He brushed a lock of hair from her face, his touch gentler than his words. "That's the problem. You should be." That night, he moved her into his penthouse. It wasn't up for discussion. A car arrived before dawn, 2 men from his security detail waiting at the curb. Nora packed a single suitcase, her fingers trembling over every item she folded. By the time they reached the high-rise, she was too tired to argue. Damian's world unfolded around her in ways she'd never seen before. Guards with coded earpieces, encrypted phones, hidden safes behind mirrored panels. The businessman she thought she knew had been replaced by something far colder, far more controlled. And yet, when he spoke to her, that edge softened. He showed her the hidden architecture of his empire. Not the violence, but the structure. The loyalty networks. The families who owed him their lives. The people who depended on his protection. "It's not about fear," he told her one night, standing before the window that overlooked the Hudson. "It's about order. When you build power on fear, it collapses. But when you build it on loyalty, it lasts." She studied him in the reflection, his hand resting lightly against the glass, the anchor tattoo glinting faintly under his cuff. And what happens when someone betrays that loyalty? He looked at her then, the answer already in his eyes. They disappear. Days pass like that, half danger, half intimacy. Nora began to understand the language of his empire, the codes whispered between his men, the way everything revolved around his word. But with understanding came exposure. One evening, she returned from the kitchen to find something on the table outside her room. A single white rose lying across an envelope. She frowned, reaching for it. Inside, a bullet rested on black velvet. No note, no signature, just the smell of cold metal and a truth she could no longer ignore. Her hand shook as she turned toward the window, the city lights flickering far below. For the first time, she understood what being his really meant. It wasn't just passion. It was danger dressed as devotion. And somewhere in the shadows of Manhattan, someone had just declared war. The message on Nora's table, a single white rose and a bullet, wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. In Damian Caruso's world, symbols spoke louder than screams, and that combination meant one thing: war. By sunrise, the city began to burn. It started quietly. Warehouse fires at the East River docks, trucks torched in the Bronx, one of Caruso's safe houses raided before dawn. The police called them coincidences. Damian called them mistakes, the kind that required correction. When he returned to the penthouse that morning, his white shirt was splattered with ash and smoke. His men followed silently, each one wearing the expression of soldiers who'd seen too much and survived only by command. Nora watched him from across the room, clutching a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. He didn't speak at first. He just stripped off his jacket, poured a glass of whiskey and downed it in one slow swallow. "They've decided to test me," he said finally, voice low. "The Vescuri family sent a rose. They think I've gone soft." Nora's stomach tightened. "Because of me." His eyes lifted. Sharp. Cold. "No. Because they think loving you makes me weak." She didn't know what to say to that. The word love hung between them like a live wire. Unspoken truth meeting unbearable tension. He turned toward the window, looking out over the skyline where thin plumes of smoke rose into the morning fog. "They've mistaken mercy for weakness." That ends tonight. By evening, the Caruso network came alive like a living organism. Messages moved in coded bursts. Calls were made through scrambled lines. Every street contact, every loyal capo, every debt owed was called in. Damian didn't bark orders. He issued them quietly, precisely, like chess moves no one could see until the game was already won. "Lock down the southern docks," he told Carlo. "Pull the Vescuri shipments off the board. I want their accounts frozen, their allies exposed." "And the informant?" Damian's eyes flicked up. "Handled." His tone made it clear the man wouldn't live to betray anyone else. Through it all, Nora stayed close. She wasn't supposed to be there. He'd told her as much, but she refused to leave. "I can help," she said, setting her laptop on his desk as his lieutenants filtered out. "I've been updating your ledgers for months. I know which businesses are clean and which ones are smokescreens. You need to know who's moving money where." He gave her a look that was equal parts disbelief and reluctant admiration. "You realize this isn't an accounting problem, right?" "Maybe not," she said evenly, "but even wars are won by logistics." For a moment, something like a smile ghosted across his lips. "You really don't scare easily, do you?" "I work for you," she said. "I can't afford to." He motioned for her to sit beside him. "Fine, then we do this together." And so they did. For the next 72 hours, the penthouse became the war room of a silent empire. Nora worked through spreadsheets and hidden ledgers, tracing money trails and coded transfers. Damian moved through phone calls and encrypted orders, dismantling the Vescuri network one strategic hit at a time. Every few hours, one of his men would report in. Another deal broken, another asset flipped, another warehouse seized. The city trembled quietly under his precision. But beneath the violence, something unexpected grew, a rhythm between them. His fury met her calm, his chaos met her logic. When he paced, she stayed still. When he shouted, she didn't flinch. Together, they became something balanced, unstoppable. At midnight on the third night, Damian slammed his phone down, chest heaving. "They hit one of my people in Queens. 2 dead." Nora rose instantly. "What do you need?" He looked at her, jaw tight. "You shouldn't have to ask that." She stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on his arm. "Then don't make me watch you do this alone." His shoulders dropped. The anger didn't vanish. It just softened. "You shouldn't be here, Nora." "I'm already here," she said. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through clenched teeth. "You have no idea what you mean to me. If they touch you again." "They won't," she interrupted, "because they'll never get the chance." Something in her tone, steady, almost defiant, made him open his eyes. For the first time since the war began, he saw not the frightened assistant who had stumbled into his office that night, but the woman who now stood beside him, unshaken. He reached out, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "You're braver than any man I've ever met." "And smarter," she added softly, a half-smile breaking the tension. He almost laughed, almost. "Don't let the others hear you say that." By the end of the week, the fires across the city began to die down. The Vescuri family's operations had crumbled under financial pressure and betrayal from within. Their lieutenants vanished. Their money vanished faster. No bullets fired in public, no bodies left on sidewalks. Just silence, the kind that only Damian Caruso could enforce. On the 6th night, he and Nora stood on the balcony overlooking the river, the cool wind sweeping through the aftermath. Below them, the city gleamed again, its chaos subdued. "It's over," she said quietly. For now. She turned to him. You won. He shook his head. We won. Her lips curved faintly. I didn't do much. You stayed, he said simply. That's everything. They stood there in the quiet, the hum of the city far beneath them. For once, no phones rang. No orders were given. Just the two of them, side by side, watching the empire he'd built hold steady in the night. Then, almost absent-mindedly, Damian reached for her hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, his grip warm and uncharacteristically gentle. Do you hear that? He asked. What? The city, he murmured, glancing down at the glowing skyline. That's silence. That's not fear anymore. That's respect. Nora smiled faintly, leaning against him. Or maybe it's exhaustion. He chuckled softly, the sound rare and fleeting. Maybe both. For the first time in weeks, Damian Caruso looked calm. Not because the war was over, but because she was still there. And as the night settled over Manhattan, one truth became undeniable. The city might tremble under his protection, but Damian Caruso's heart now belonged entirely to the woman who refused to tremble at all. 3 weeks had passed since the war ended. 3 weeks since the fires stopped burning, since the phone stopped ringing in the dead of night, since blood had last been spilled in Damian Caruso's name. For the first time in years, New York breathed again, and so did he. The city still whispered his name, of course. It always would, but the whispers had changed. They carried a different kind of fear now, one laced with respect and curiosity. The man who'd once ruled through silence and precision had turned unpredictable. Because for the first time, Damian Caruso had someone to lose. Nora Blake. She moved quietly through his penthouse as though she'd always belonged there. Her laughter had replaced the hollow echo of his solitude. Her voice softened the edges of rooms that had once felt like fortresses. She organized his business calls, corrected his reports, and somehow, in between all the details of his empire, she had become the calm heartbeat at its center. That night, they dined together at the long marble table overlooking the skyline. The city lights shimmered against the glass walls, the kind of view most men would kill for. But Damian didn't look at Manhattan. He looked at her. Nora's hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, her expression unreadable as she pushed a piece of pasta around her plate. She wore one of his shirts, soft gray cotton that dwarfed her frame. But she looked more composed than any of the men who'd ever sat in his boardrooms. You're quiet, he said, breaking the silence. She smiled faintly. I'm still getting used to all this. All this. The peace, she said. The quiet. You're not getting phone calls every 5 minutes. He leaned back, studying her. You make it sound unnatural. Maybe it is, she said softly. But I think you like it. He didn't answer right away. He just reached across the table, his hand finding hers. The touch was simple, steady, grounding, but to Nora it felt heavier than any declaration. I don't remember what quiet felt like before you, he said finally. Her fingers tightened around his. You didn't have quiet. You had control. They're not the same thing. Damian's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. And what do I have now? She looked at him for a long time before answering. Peace. Maybe even freedom. He huffed a quiet laugh. Freedom? That's not a word people associate with me. Maybe they should. The candlelight flickered between them, painting his sharp features in gold and shadow. The man across from her wasn't the legend whispered about in back rooms. He wasn't the cold strategist who'd reduced entire crime families to ghosts. He was just Damian, tired, scarred, and human in a way she hadn't thought possible. After dinner, they moved to the balcony. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain and the hum of distant traffic. Below them, Manhattan pulsed with light. Above them, the sky was wide and open, something neither of them had noticed before. Damian rested his forearms on the railing, eyes sweeping across the skyline like he owned it. In many ways, he did. But his gaze wasn't hungry anymore. It was almost reverent. You see that? He asked quietly. Nora stepped beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "See what? The silence," he murmured. "You can feel it if you listen. No gunfire. No sirens. No chaos. That's me protecting what's mine." Her breath caught, not because of the words, but the way he said them. Not as a boast, but as a confession. She turned to him. "And what exactly is yours, Damian?" He looked at her then, eyes dark and steady. "Everything I've built. Every inch of this city that still remembers my name." He paused, his voice softening. "But mostly you." The honesty hit her like warmth after winter. She stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of his collar, where the anchor tattoo peeked from beneath his shirt. "This symbol," she said, tracing it gently, "still feels like a chain?" He exhaled, eyes closing briefly at her touch. "Not anymore." "What does it feel like now?" "Like gravity," he whispered. "Like something that keeps me from floating away." Her chest tightened. "You think I keep you grounded?" "I know you do." He turned toward her then, one hand rising to cup her face. His thumb brushed across her cheek, slow and careful. The night pressed close around them, quiet except for the sound of their breaths. "You changed everything, Nora," he said. "You took the worst parts of me and made them mean something." She smiled softly. "I didn't change you, Damian. You just stopped pretending you couldn't be good." He laughed under his breath, a sound she'd rarely heard. It was low, real, and almost boyish. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside went on. Cars, lights, the endless hum of New York, but up here, time didn't matter. He leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his hand still tangled in her hair. We pulled back. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to think love was a weakness. And now—" He looked at her, his expression softened by something dangerously close to peace. "Now I think it's the only thing strong enough to make me stop fighting." Nora's eyes shimmered in the city light. "So what happens now, Mr. Caruso?" He turned back to the view, the faintest smile curving his lips. "Now we live." She laughed quietly, leaning into his shoulder. "That's simple." "For once, yes," he said. They stood there together, two silhouettes against the glittering skyline. Him, the man who had once ruled by fear. Her, the woman who taught him how to breathe again. Below them, the city stretched endless and alive, trembling not from violence, but from the power of peace. And as Damian's hand closed around hers, strong and certain, Nora realized the truth she'd been too afraid to say out loud. He wasn't her savior. She wasn't his redemption. They were each other's anchor. The city remembered that night. The night the lights dimmed. The night silence became its own language. They said Damian Caruso turned the east side into ice and made the streets whisper his name again. Maybe that's true. But behind every story of power, there's always a quieter truth. A man who finally found something worth protecting, and a woman who refused to be afraid of the dark. Nora Blake never planned to fall in love with a monster. But sometimes monsters don't destroy you. They guard you. Sometimes love doesn't heal softly. It burns through everything until all that's left is truth, loyalty, and the kind of silence that can make a whole city tremble. If this story hit you right in the chest, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what line hit you the hardest. And if you want early access to the next Mafia Soul video, hit that subscribe, tap the bell, and join the family. Because every week, we dive deep into the kind of love that scars and still saves. These stories are born in the shadows and told with the heart. See you in the next video.